forwards and turn the other way, backwards and turn. So it is working. Welcome back to Arcade. I am Super Tommy, and in this video, we're gonna look at player movement with Phaser 3 and Matter.js with ECS. Now, if you enjoy our videos on ECS with Phaser 3 and Matter.js, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos on these game development topics. It is also the best way to support the channel. Now for player movement, we're going to need to add 4 more components here. You can see them: the rotation, velocity, input, and player, or CPU if we're going to make this a CPU driven tank. We're not going to do that in this video, but it is another component you can have instead of having player movement, have CPU controlled movement like we did in our arcade physics Phaser 3 and ECS videos. So we had our position and matter sprite components added in the last video. So this one we're going to add these 4 other components so that we can add player movement. Now let's look a bit at these other components. So we have the velocity component. That's going to be similar to our position component with just the X and Y properties. Then our rotation component has an angle. Our input component is going to have left, right, up, and down. So now that's just going to represent whether the up key is pressed, the down key is pressed, the left key is pressed, or the right key is pressed. It's going to map basically to Phaser's cursor keys. So we'll show you how to do that in the system. And then in player, the player component, it's just a tag. There's no properties on it. If you made a CPU component, it would be the same. There's no, well, actually that's not true. The CPU component may need more logic than that, and you could put it in there like our arcade physics video. But in this case for the player here, it's just a tag, just so that we can say this entity is a player. Now let's add those components in code. All right, let's take a look at adding our rotation and velocity components to our entity here. So first we got to create our components. Now we've already done that since they're very simple. We'll just go over them. Let's look at our rotation component here. So it's similar to the other components we've already made. We call it define component from bitECS, and then give it the component schema, which simply notes what properties are on this component and what their type is. So we have an angle for our rotation component, and it's going to be of type float 32. So angle is going to be in radians to match Phaser 3's angle, which is also in radians. And so that's a float 32 type, so we're going to use float 32 for this as well. Now let's look at our velocity component. Now this is similar to our position component. It's got X and Y properties, and they're also of type float 32. So it's very similar to what we've done before. Now to add those components, it's just like we've done for the position and our matter sprite component. We'll just go over it again. Add component. We're going to call add component, pass in the world, and then pass in the component and the entity ID, which is tank. And so we can just leave rotation at 0. That's what it's going to default to, so we don't need to set anything. And we can do add component for velocity as well, velocity tank, and also it's going to default to 0 for X and Y, so we don't need to do anything. Now that's it. And so this component, this entity now has the position component, the matter sprite component, and the rotation and velocity components. Now actually one more thing we need is the input component. Almost forgot about that input component. Let's come back up here and import the input component. So import from components input and input. So let's go look at it. Now, very similar to all our other components, except it's got 4 properties like we talked about previously. It's going to have up, down, left, right, and it's going to be of type uint8, since we're basically using this to represent a Boolean true or false. Now, 0 is going to be false, and 1 or higher is going to be true. So that's all for this component. And you see how we're importing it, import brackets, the name of the component from wherever the file is located. That's just here. We export this. This is not a default export. It's just a normal export. We can then import it with the brackets. So now let's add our input component to our entity, our tank entity, like we've done others. So add component this.world input and tank, and we also don't need to set anything because 0 is false, and our input component is going to default all those properties left, right, up, down to 0. All right, so now that we've added all those new components to our entity, we can create our systems that we need. So we're going to need 3 systems here: the matter physics system, the player system, and then that steering system. Now we're not going to cover the steering system in this video. We're going to go through the logic for it, since it's more complicated, in a future video or the next video in this series. So here we're going to look at the matter physics system and the player system. Now the matter physics system is going to take the rotation, velocity, and matter sprite components, or any entity that has those 3 components, and we're going to set the values of rotation and velocity on that matter sprite. Now the player component is going to take our input component and player components, and then map the cursor key values that we press to the input component left, right, up, down values. So properties. So now let's see how that works in code. All right, let's code our player system. So we've created a bunch of setup code here. If you watched our previous videos, you can see how that was all set up, but I'll just briefly go into what we're doing here. So we're importing Phaser, importing our define system and define query from bitECS. That's our ECS library. And we're going to use the player and input component, player and input components like we just talked about. And so we're going to create a system with a query for those 2 components. So we've defined our query already here on line 11, as you can see. And in our system, when we define our system, we're going to get all the entities for that query, loop over them. What we want to do for our input component, set the left, right, up, and down values based on the cursor keys left, right, down, left, right, up, down is down. So whether if it's true, we're going to set it to 1, or basically if it's false, we're going to set it to 0. If it's true, we're going to set it to 1 or higher. So we're basically mimicking a Boolean with a number, since we can't, or it's not currently supported to have Booleans in our components. And it may never, unless JavaScript adds a Boolean array like the int32 array or the int8 arrays that they currently have. But nonetheless, we can work around that by just saying 0 is false, anything else is true. So that's what we're going to do here. So based on our cursor keys is down value, true or false, we're going to set either 0 or 1. So let's start here. So just like before, in previous systems we've created, we're going to loop through all entities and get the ID out like this. So we're going to get our input component here. So let's say left index in by ID, and it will be 1 or 0 depending on cursor keys. No, so cursors dot left dot is down. So when this is true, we're going to say 1, and if it's false, we're going to say 0. And we're going to do the same thing for right, let's say, and it's going to be right. I'm going to do the same thing for down. So I mean, maybe you can type this faster than me. Let's see. Let's see. Can you type this faster? If you're doing it right now, I guess you'll know. And boom. There it is. I think that's all we need. I guess we'll see if I'm correct or not. But that's the crux of the system. What we want to do is just set the values of left, right, up, down based on the cursor keys, what the cursor keys tells us. So now let's create the system in our scene. Let's go here to our matter ECS scene. So let's come here. We want to create our system here. So we're going to create it after making our matter sprites. That probably works. Let's do create player system. And we're going to give it our cursor keys. We've already made cursor keys in this scene, but if you need a refresher on that, it's over here. This.cursor keys is set to this.input.keyboard.create cursor keys. So the cursor keys is just a convenience from Phaser 3 that gives us access to the up, down, left, right keys plus the spacebar. We're only using the arrow keys here. So we created our player system. Next, we are going to create our matter physics system. Right now, let's look at creating the matter physics system. So this system, what it's going to do is set the values we're setting in the rotation and velocity components to that matter sprite, to the matter sprite belonging to that entity. So we've set up the boilerplate here. So like all of our systems, when we make them, we have a function that creates it. Then it returns defined system from bitECS, which creates the actual system in this function. So for our query, like we've needed for every single system, we need a query. This query is going to act on any entity with the rotation, velocity, and matter sprite components like we talked about. So once we have that query, we can go through, get all the entities, every update that match this query, and then operate on them. So what we're going to do is get the component values and put them into our matter sprite. So let's do that. So we have our ID here. So we've done this for a bunch of other systems. So we're going to just skip that here. We're going to use that ID to get our sprite. So we have our sprite map here. So get by ID. And just like we've done previously, if for some reason we don't have the sprite, we're just going to continue. We don't expect that to ever be the case, but you never know. So if something goes wrong and we don't have that sprite, we're just going to ignore it and continue. And just continue with the next entities that may be in this list and operate on them. So what we're going to want to do is sprite.angle. We're going to set to our rotation component for this entity. So the angle value for this entity, that ID, we're going to set it to our sprite, our matter sprite's angle property, and do the same for velocity. So sprite.set velocity, we're going to do velocity dot x for our entity, and velocity dot y for our entity. Cool. And that is all we need here. So just to double check in case you don't know where we got these components from, we have simply imported them here and we created these previously. And actually, let's show you them if you've forgotten. The rotation is this and the velocity is this. Very simple. So we're almost ready to test out all the code we've just written to have our tank move with arrow keys. So the last system we want to talk about is the steer system. Just very briefly in this video, I'm going to show you here. This is the code. We just dropped this in. There's a bunch of logic here that we will discuss in the next video. But this is the gist of that system. It's just gonna control how we steer. So to use it, let's go back to our scene here. Now we've added our player system and we just created our matter physics system. So let's add the two components that we still need, the steering system and the matter physics system. So first let's add the steering system. So create steering system, and we can give it a speed. Let's just default it to whatever the default is. And then we're going to do create matter physics system, and that's going to need nothing. So this is the order that we want. We want the player system to set the inputs. Then we want the steering system using the inputs set what the tank's going to be, the velocity and the rotation component values. And then we are going to put those values into the matter sprite in our matter physics system that we just created. Okay, so we did forget one component. That's the key. That's the player tag component. So we have created that. So let's come back up here and go import from components player. And let's do that. Now let's just briefly look at this component. So we talked about this player component as just a tag, meaning it has no properties. And so we see how we created is just simply calling define component, giving it no scheme at all. It's just a tag. It has no properties on it. Now we're going to add this component to our tank. we can still use it. It's still a component, but it's simply a tag component. So add component this.world player and tank. Now let's bring Chrome up here. Let's see if this works. Press up. Whoa, way too fast. So we did have to give it a value here, right? Is this the one? Yeah. Let's say it should be 5. Okay, up. There we go. Back, up, or forward, backwards, forwards, backwards. Now let's do forwards and turn the other way, backwards and turn. So it is working. So look at that. We are steering and we've got our tank moving. So that's all those components we added and all the systems we added to get this to work. Okay, so that's it for adding player movement in Phaser 3 with Matter.js and ECS. So we've got our tank here and it can move. Looks pretty cool. So there's the steering system that we haven't talked about that we will talk about in the next video. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to hit like and subscribe for more videos on making games with Phaser 3, with Matter.js, with the N80 component system, and definitely come back for the steering system logic in the next video.